Good morning. If you got a Bible, Galatians 6 is where we're going to start out. Galatians chapter 6, if you want to be turning back over there. Whenever there's something new that's important, that's valuable, most of the time it's either invented or it is discovered. In inventions, we understand somebody had in their mind, I want to do this, I want to create this, there's a need, let's figure out how we can make something that's going to meet this need. Discoveries, to me, are a little bit more interesting. I like it whenever you can read a story about somebody who just happened to find a way to do this or happened to find a solution to that. What you see on the screen behind me, I'll admit, is pretty nasty if I tell you what it is, and I will in a second. It's pretty nasty, though, and it'll make you rethink your life, maybe. But in 1928, a guy named Alexander Fleming was not really a clean scientist. He dealt with chemicals and he dealt with trying to find out solutions to problems medically. But he wasn't very clean with his space. And so he had some stuff in a petri dish and he was trying to figure out a way to fight some kind of disease. And he goes away for a 2-week vacation and he comes back and he notices that there's a growth on one of his petri dishes. But what he really figured out is around that growth, nothing else would grow. So the disease he's trying to fight, staph, I believe, would not grow around whatever was growing in his petri dish. And lo and behold, he didn't invent it, but he discovered penicillin, which has saved countless lives. By the way, this is a kid's hand. He was playing outside, and some scientist said, put your hand on this petri dish. And he put the hand on the petri dish, and a few weeks later, wash your hands, okay? So there's one. A few years later, 1945, a guy named Percy Rutledge was working on some radar during World War II. And he was working with some waves, microwaves. You've probably heard of those. But he was not trying to cook foods. But what happens is he's got a chocolate bar in his pocket, and he's trying to work on microwaves and figure out how radar can work better. And he reaches in his pocket to get the chocolate bar, and that's what he gets. He gets melted chocolate. And so he figures out something about these waves that I'm working with. I didn't invent them, but I'm discovering here that they melt chocolate and they melt food. And you would never guess what the first food cooked in a microwave was. It was popcorn, believe it or not. How cool is that? And then there's another one that happened centuries before those two that is every bit as interesting to me. There was a guy named Archimedes, and his king needed to figure out if the crown that he had was fully gold or if it was some kind of composite that he had paid way too much money for. And so Archimedes is a great mathematician during that time and was charged with trying to figure out, is this real gold or is it a little bit fake on the inside? And so Archimedes one day is trying to figure out, how am I going to figure this out? How am I going to find out if this crown is 100% gold or if it's got some other metals mixed in? And he sits down in his bathtub one day, and he's taking a bath, and the tub was a little bit too full, and the water flows over the edge. And Archimedes is trying to figure out, why did this just happen? I had water in the tub, and I sit down. Why did I go down, and why did the water come up? And so he gets this discovery in his mind, and I would try to explain it to you, but I can't. But he figures out why ships can float and why anchors made out of the same material can sink. He figures out that there's something that correlates the buoyancy of the boats with the water, and that's how you can figure out how to make a boat float and how to make an anchor made out of the same material sink. Now, none of these guys, penicillin or microwaves or Archimedes' principle, not one of them invented what we're talking about. Every one of them discovered a principle or a thought or a thing that was already present, and they figured out how to harness that for their good. And so whenever there is a principle like this that's discovered, we can use it for our good, or we can ignore it at a pretty big cost to us. We read just a few minutes ago, Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, and really on down through verse 10. There's a biblical principle here. And the principle is, you reap what you sow. You gather together, you harvest what you plant. You get out of it what you give into it. And that's a principle that we can either use to our benefit as Christians, as people, or it's one that we can ignore at a pretty large cost to us. And so if you go back and look at Galatians chapter 6, this is coming at near the end of Paul's letter to the Galatians. There are 6 chapters. As Paul usually does, the first 3 or the first half of the book, they're laying out some pretty heavy doctrine. He's talking about the gospel, and he's talking about what the gospel is and what the gospel means. And then when he gets over to chapter 4, he says, here's what it means for you. Here's how you can use this gospel, these principles we talked about, Here's how you can use them for your benefits, or you can ignore them at a pretty large cost to you. In Galatians 6, he gets into here and he says, we talked about last week about how everybody's got a burden that we can bear, and we can stand on our own 2 feet at times. There is a part of Galatians 6, bear one another's burdens, but there's also a part of Galatians 6 to bear your own loads. That's part of Christian growth, realizing that God has enabled us and equipped us as people to bear what he's given us, to endure what he's putting us through or allowing us to go through. That's part of Christian growth. A second thing that we got to see, I think, in Galatians chapter 6 at verse 7 is that there's this principle of you reap what you sow. Whatever we're planting, whatever seeds are going into the ground, we're going to have to deal with those. That's a principle. I didn't invent it. You didn't invent it, but we discover it as we read the Bible, and it's a principle discovered that we can use to our benefit or we can ignore at a pretty large cost to us. And so if you will, Galatians chapter 6, let's just kind of pick up verse 6, Galatians 6:6. Let one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Verse 7, it's pretty interesting. He says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. And so it's pretty interesting to me, the phrases about God is not mocked, don't be deceived, because I think with this teaching, what Paul's talking about here, it's tempting for us to say, you know what, there's no consequence in life. It's pretty tempting maybe for us to say, I can do whatever I want to do, and I'm going to be forgiven for that, and I don't have to deal with any of the repercussions or consequences. I don't have to deal with any of the bad stuff that's going to come along with the decisions that I choose to make in my life. And Paul says, look, don't be deceived like that. Don't think that's true. God's not mocked. Forgiveness does not equal no consequences. Just because, maybe I did something I shouldn't have done, or I really said some things I shouldn't have said, forgiveness for that, I can be forgiven, but that doesn't mean that I don't have to deal with what I've done, right? It doesn't mean that I get out scot-free and I'm free from the burden of any consequence that my decision or choices, behavior, words might have. Don't be deceived. That's not how it works. God's not mocked. Forgiveness, yes, but that doesn't mean I don't have to deal with any of these consequences. And then he says, here's the principle you got to see, and you got to discover it. And you've got to listen to it if you want to be benefited by it, but you can ignore it, and it's going to come at a cost to you. We reap what we sow. And so this fits pretty well in a series that we're calling Blame It All on My Roots. Last week, we kicked it off and talked about how our roots are Adam and Eve, and our roots figured out how God wants us to be responsible, but we can be irresponsible with what God has given us, and we can live our lives in very irresponsible ways. And so when we, today, 2019, when we live irresponsibly, whenever we shirk our responsibilities, we can blame it on our roots a little bit, Adam and Eve, but let's learn from those roots. That was last week. Today, still tied in with the root idea, is that we plant things in our lives. That's what Paul says, Galatians chapter 6. We plant things. We plant seeds. And if you put a seed in the ground and it gets the water and the sunlight, it's not just going to remain a seed for its entire life, right? Seeds grow into plants, and plants grow into bigger plants, and bigger plants produce fruits in our lives. That seed leads to roots. And so the seeds we plant become the roots that make up our lives, and those roots produce bigger plants, and the bigger plants produce the fruit in my life. And that's the words and the actions and the behaviors and how I live, who I am, and my character and my characteristics. What I want you to see is that life is connected. I don't get to do something today and not have to deal with the consequences of it tomorrow. I don't get to do something today and maybe a week down the road or a month down the road or a year down the road. I don't get to just act like it never happened. If it's bad, I can be forgiven for it, but that does not mean that I don't have to deal with any of the consequences that it brings into my life. Does that make sense? I hope it does. All right? Forgiveness, yes. But doing away with consequences, the results of my behavior, no, because I reap what I sow. That's Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. The seeds that I plant are going to grow into the fruit that we have in our lives, and there's just no way around this. And what it boils down to is this idea that I've got to be responsible for me. I've got to be responsible for planting in my life. And you got to be responsible for you. We talked last week about own your slice, right? If you have this whole 100% circle of all of the conflict and problems that you've got in life, a lot of those are not because of you. There are coworkers and there are friends and there are neighbors that bring problems into your life. Last week it was own your slice. Figure out what percentage of these problems is my slice. Which one am I responsible for? And then really take responsibility for that. We'll get there again. But this week it's a little bit different. Yeah, I got to own the slice and I got to be responsible for me. And that means that I've got to admit that probably the most common denominator in my problems is me. Because I said something last week that I got to deal with today and next week, right? And so it's the red slice. That's part of me. Or I did something a year ago that's still right here, 2 weeks into a new year, I'm still dealing with this problem I got because of something I did a year ago. I'm reaping maybe what I've sown. The most common denominator in my problems and the conflict in my life, it has to be me. It's not you. It's not somebody else. It's me. It's us, right? That's who we are. And I've got to realize that, and I've got to admit it. And that means that I admit I reap, I harvest what seeds I'm planting in the ground. So think about your problems for a second. And whatever they are, the conflict that's in your life, the struggles that you've got, the consequences that you really wish that you weren't dealing with, but today, here you are, and you are dealing with those consequences. Is it something you did? Is it something you bought, something you leased? Is it something you built in your life? Seeds like that we've planted. Is it something you drank, something you smoked, something you ate that's brought some kind of difficult situation in your life, and it continues to bring a difficult situation in your life, and it grows, and it festers, and it feels like it becomes worse and worse and worse and worse? Here's the principle that probably at some point we ignored or we acted like wasn't there. We just decided we're not going to think about right now. I reap what I sow. Whatever I put in, that's probably I'm going to get something out related to that, and I can accept that, and I can just say, I believe you, God. I believe you, Paul. I believe this reap what you sow principle, or I can ignore it at a great cost to me, and probably a great cost to my family, and a great cost to my church, and a great cost to all the people who are around me. You reap what you sow. You get out, a lot of times, what you put in. You harvest what you plant. And it gets a little worse before it gets better. Because think about it. The seed is small, right? You put a seed into the ground, and you probably have to look pretty closely to see what that seed is. But then it gets a little water, and gets a little sunlight, and it grows. And eventually it becomes a plant. And that plant eventually, if everything works right, that plant is going to eventually create something like this, a plant that bears fruit. We talk sometimes about, life gives you lemons, and yes, if life gives you lemons, then you make lemonade out of those lemons. In lemons, we get the idea they're just kind of sour, they're bitter, and nobody wants lemons in life. Nobody wants to deal with sourness and bitterness and terrible times and conflict and consequences of the decisions we've made. Right, nobody wants that. But when life gives us lemons, maybe today a better question is, did I plant some lemon trees along the way? Whenever I get things in life that I don't want to deal with and I don't like and they're difficult and it's just not fun at all and it steals your joy, could I really think, where's this coming from? Was there a seed that I planted along the way somewhere? Did I plant this in my life and now I'm having to reap what I've sown years and years ago or weeks and weeks ago or yesterday? Am I having to deal with some kind of problem I've got because of a seed that I planted in my life? Maybe. And the seed grows into a plant, and plants bear fruit, which create more seeds that go into the ground, and they create more plants, and it bears more fruit. And if you notice, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so maybe today what you're dealing with in 2019 is a product of what you did in 2018 or what you said in 2017 or how you acted 10 years ago, and you're dealing with a consequence, a problem, a conflict that has come up because of that, and that's just part of the principle. When you think about fruit, it grows bigger, gets bigger. The plants get bigger, the root system gets bigger, the fruit gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you pull the fruit off, and it goes into a store, and you go buy it from the store, and it sits on your counter for 2 weeks. And when you want a banana, you go, and the banana's not yellow anymore. It's brown because the fruit has festered, and now it's ruined. It's rotten. Or you got the cuties, the little oranges that we all like to eat 6 of, and it sits on your counter, and you think, I'm going to go get me a cutie, right? And you get over there, and it's all mushy, and the bottom of it's black because it sat around. Nobody did anything with it. Nobody touched it, and it festered, and it got rotten, and now it's gross, and you don't want to deal with it. Or you go get it out of the fridge. You've had some fruit in there, and it's got the little mold spot just on one end, though, and then you have the conversation in your head. Right? You already know what I'm saying, right? Do I cut it off and eat it, or do I throw the whole thing away? I don't think I'm the only one that has that conversation, right? It's a principle that we live with, right? It starts off as a seed, and it grows into a root system, and a root system grows up to a plant, and the plant bears fruit, and the fruit that comes from this little bitty tiny seed can be good or it can be dangerous. It can be good for us, it can benefit us, it can bless our lives, or it can destroy us. And those are the seeds that you plant and I plant every day. The word that we say is a seed planted. A thought that we have in our minds, that we allow to stay in our minds, that's a seed that is planted there. Make sense? The actions that we have, the things that we do, how we respond to people, those are seeds that are planted in our lives. And here's the principle that you've got to see this morning, right? That seed, we're going to have to deal with later. And so what words I say and what actions I have and who I become, those are seeds that plant in my life, and eventually I got to reap that. And it's going to be a reward or it's going to be a consequence. So own your slice. Figure out what part of my life is my responsibility and take that responsibility. Worry about that, but worry about that. Take it as your responsibility. Don't just say, okay, 75% of that circle is not my slice at all, so I'm not going to deal with that. Oh, and by the way, this 25% that is my slice, that is my responsibility, I'm not going to deal with that either. That's not what we're saying. We're saying cut the pie and own your slice and figure out, this is my responsibility. This 25%, that's on me. These are my words. These are my actions. That's my response to the terrible, difficult situation. That's going to show my heart. But take responsibility for it. Own the slice. And once you figure out, okay, this is my responsibility, here's the big one. Do what you should have been doing already. It's easy for me to say, I've got 5 years of neglecting my responsibility, or I got a decade of not being the person I should have been, or I got 25 years of not being the husband or the wife or the parent that I really should have been to my kids. Right. Maybe that's true. And if it is true, let's not act like it's not true. Those are seeds that have been planted. The 5 years of neglect, that's 5 years of seeds that have been planting that we've got to harvest now. Those 10 years of not being the person that you should have been, that's 10 years of seeds that have been planted in your life. And yes, you got to reap that harvest at some point. Those 25 years of not being the husband, the wife, the spouse, the parent, the child that you really should have been, that's 25 years of seeds that are planted in your life. And yeah, you got to deal with the consequences. Can I be forgiven for those mistakes? Absolutely. But forgiveness doesn't mean that I don't have to deal with the consequences. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. We reap what we must, or we reap what we sow. When I figure out that I've been ignoring this principle, and I figure out that, for 5, 10, 25 years, for years, I've been acting like this principle doesn't exist, and I've been sowing my wild seeds, and I got to harvest those now. And I've been going out and not thinking about anybody else. And I got to deal with the consequences with that. And the way that I live my life for the last several years, maybe I got to deal with the repercussions that come as a result of not doing what I should have been doing this whole time. But that doesn't give me an excuse to not do what I know that I should do now. So when I own my slice and I figure out what part of my life is really my responsibility, what part of my conflicts and my problems and the disagreements are on me, I got to own it. And owning it says, I'm going to start doing now what I should have been doing all along. It's not going to take away all of the results and the consequences of past decisions or indecisions, but it's going to start planting good seeds today. It's going to change how I talk. It's going to change the words that come out of my mouth. It's going to change how we respond to different situations in life. It's going to change how we treat our neighbors. It's going to change how we love one another. It's going to change my commitment to God. And so here's the principle. I'm the most common denominator in my problems. And you are too. It's not somebody else. It's not them. It's not those people. It's you. And it's me. We are at the root of our problems because we've planted the seeds that grew into these roots that we can blame all of our problems on today. So blame it all on your roots. Yes. But let's not say that just because I got these roots in my life and they're destructive and they're causing me a lot of problems and there's all this conflict in my world right now, just because those roots are there, let's not use that as an excuse to not plant more roots. If you got a lot of lemons coming up in your life because you planted lemon trees 10 years ago, let's not use that as an excuse to not use our land to plant better seeds, to plant things that are going to bring joy, to plant things in our lives, to plant seeds in our lives that are going to bring happiness to us and to those people around us. I got to tell you that the day that you decide to own this principle, you reap what you sow. The day that you decide to stop planting those bad seeds and to start planting good seeds in your world, the day that you decide to make this change, it's going to be the best day in the world for you and for your family and your friends and all the people who love you. Because you got to deal with this. The seeds that you're planting in life, the words that you say, the actions, how you respond to people, if you respond to people at all, the seeds you plant are either going to bless you or they're going to catch up with you. And it very well could be today that something's caught up with you. And it could be that you figured out at some point leading up to this day that this is a lemon that I got to deal with in my life. Because 5, 10, 20, 25 years ago, I planted the seed. And it's grown into a lemon tree. And it's brought all these terrible things in my life. And the seed you planted has caught up with you. But don't let that stop you from planting good seeds today. The seeds that you plant, they will either bless you and those around you, or they will catch up with you, and they're going to cause you some problems. So own your slice. Do today what you should have been doing all along. Let's plant better seeds. And instead of growing lemon trees in our lives, let's grow some things that are going to bear good fruit. Let's grow some things that are going to be helpful, that are going to build up, they're going to draw us closer to God, and they're going to draw others closest to God too. So maybe you're here this morning, and I don't know where that finds you. You might be somebody, and I hope that you are, that you've planted good seeds your whole life, and there's not been a terrible, rotten seed ever planted in your world. I hope that's you, but I'm pretty sure it's not, because we're humans. And so maybe you're here this morning, and you've got a lot of roots that you can blame your problems on, but they're roots from seeds that you planted. And so maybe today we decide that I got to deal with that, and I got to start living like this principle of reaping what I sow is real. And so maybe today that means you right some wrongs. And you cut down some of those plants that have grown up from some of those seeds that you planted that you didn't mean to plant, but you got to reap them today. Maybe that means you cut those down and you cut off the relationship, or you cut out that behavior, or you do something that you should have been doing all along. Maybe you're here this morning and it's time for you to grow into the person that God wants you to be. Plant good roots. And some of those roots might be that you put your faith in God. That's a good root. It's going to grow into a very healthy plant. It's going to bring good things to your life. Maybe there are things in your life that you need to turn away from. That's a good root to say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to cut it off and cut it out. Do that. That's a good root. Maybe a root that you need to start this morning is beginning your journey with Christ. And so maybe today is the day that you put your faith into action. You're baptized into Christ. The sins are washed away, not consequences, but the forgiveness is there. It's poured out on you. And you get to start fresh and living like you're reaping what you're sowing. Maybe there are a lot of things going on in your life right now, and you know products of what you've done or what you've said or how you acted or the behaviors that you had. And so maybe today's the day that just between you and God, you say, I'm going to be better. And you recommit to living the life that God wants you to live. Maybe there's some seeds that are growing into plants, and we can pray about those in your life right now. We're going to sing this invitation song. And it's going to invite you to come just as you are, realizing that we're broken and that we hurt, we make mistakes because we plant seeds that are very destructive for our lives, but we can do better. And this morning, if you want to start that process in planting good seeds, we invite you to come or to make a private commitment to God where you are. But whatever your need might be, let's do it now while together we stand and while we sing this song. Your